and we are at, let's see, the 5th of the 27th of the 5th month, and we're going to do our monthly catch up on African commercial aviation. Sean, it's always good to see you.
Always good to be here.
Thank you very much. And what we want to talk about a little bit is there was chatter this last month about Qatar having some interest in investing somewhere in the South African. Was it the South African? It's not quite clear how specific they were, but of course that set the cat amongst the pigeons. Now you're local there, and you know what's going on. Or if you don't know, you have a very good idea, as the smile indicates. What do you think is happening there, if you can disclose?
Well, I don't have any first-hand information. So first things, let's go straight to that. And in fact, talking to multiple people at Qatar Airways, they don't have any information either. I mean, my best source at Qatar, when I said, "Who are you buying?" he said, "Look, the first I've heard of it is when I heard the CEO mention it in the press conference." So if this is happening, it's something that's happening, and cards are being held very close to the chest, even within the Qatar Airways organization. But look, Qatar Airways has a history of overpromising and underdelivering when it comes to partnerships in Africa. They've been talking about an investment in Rwanda for over 4 years now, coming up on 5 years. They've been planning to take 49% of Rwanda, and that still hasn't come into fruition. Despite closer ties between those two airlines, the investment hasn't happened. So to come out and say that, for their CEO to say that we're in discussions that will be finalized in the next 3 to 4 weeks to acquire a stake in a Southern African airline, I think is being very optimistic, knowing the way that Africa works and having seen Qatar Airways' own track record in a friendly investment in Rwanda, where the government is ready to roll over and pretty much let them take that stake. A lot of the speculation in the media has been out there that this is going to be South African Airways or one of the Southern African carriers. I won't rule it out. I will simply say that South Africa, as we discussed on a previous podcast here, South Africa has very restrictive regulations on foreign ownership. So for Qatar Airways to come in to invest in a South African registered or licensed carrier, they would they would be capped at having 25% voting control, not just ownership or, some way to structure it, control, and of that airline, no more than 25% could be vested in a foreign entity. And consequently, it basically means they'd be putting cash into something where they wouldn't be able to control it. And I cannot see Qatar Airways being ready to part with their cash that easily. I mean, they're a rich airline from a rich country, but they're not fools. And doing something like that, especially in a market like South Africa, especially right now with uncertainty about economic policy going forward as a new government will come in, by next month, I have my doubts that it's going to be South African Airways or any of the other South African carriers. The reality is there are two other carriers in Southern Africa which have both national airlines, which have expressed the need to have partnerships, some, maybe to sell part of the stake, maybe to enter into some sort of strategic partnership or whatever. One of those is LAM Mozambique. Now, LAM has had a litany of mismanagement under, poor policy making by the Mozambican government. The Mozambican government backed two national carriers for a while, which it just made no sense in terms of Mozambique's policy. They have a so-called restructuring partner right now whose contract ends within the next month or so, and it's quite possible that Qatar Airways, they already fly to Maputo. They already have a fairly strong presence there. Maybe a potential of coming in there. Mozambique is a decent market that is currently underserved both domestically and regionally. So there's a lot of potential there. But there's also a minefield in terms of poor government policy making, corruption, and all the usual litany of African ills. The other one is Zimbabwe, and Air Zimbabwe has decades of Phoenix rising from the ashes and Phoenix falling right back into the ashes again. And right now they've been cleaning up a bit. They've managed to find homes for those ancient 767s of theirs. They've got a slightly more recent fleet than 40-year-old averages, with 737-200s flying around. So they've got Embraer 145s and the like. But they're significantly struggling from access to funds and foreign exchange. And again, they could benefit. It's a fairly large market. It's another market that Qatar Airways has an interest in serving. And Harare's geographic location is ideal for serving the Southern African market. So I think if there is actually some fire behind the smoke of this rumor, and not just a CEO talking out his backside as CEOs tend to do in forums like he did, I think Mozambique and Zimbabwe would probably make the most sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what Qatar is actually looking at. It could be pretty much anywhere.
And of course, in Zimbabwe, we've got those two I believe, Thai 777s.
Are they actually still parked there? I thought one went off back to Malaysia for a seat check and one's in Addis.
I saw a picture from somebody who I know was recently there, and lo and behold, there was a 777 there.
Okay, one of them might be there then. Yeah,
just collecting dust.
Yes, that's well, I don't even think it's collecting dust. I think it's past that stage. These two aircraft never flew a revenue flight for Zimbabwe Airlines / Air Zimbabwe / whatever entity. It was a complete political boondoggle in terms of their procurement. It was pretty much driven by the former president's son-in-law, from my understanding. He's a former Qatar Airways pilot who came back and, well, basically appointed himself in charge of the national airline, acquired these two aircraft, which were not in a condition to be put into service for various reasons, regulatory, technical, and the like, and they never flew a revenue flight. So somebody made money on that deal, but it definitely wasn't poor Air Zimbabwe.
Okay, what we want to try today is something a little different. What I would like to do with you is to do a screen share of a data model. And what we want to talk about here, and I'm going to bring up that now. Hopefully you can see it.
I can.
You can. I'm hoping that viewers can see it. Okay, so what we have here is a data model that is basically for the African Association, the Airlines Association of South Africa. And what we have is data from the AXA, which is the airports of South Africa. And here we have from the fiscal year 2012-13, they have an odd fiscal year, not a normal January-December year, starts in April. And I thought we'd go through this because in light of the fact that we've got, as you saw, South African Airways announced a whole bunch of code share deals, which is an odd thing because the airline clearly cannot seem to grow on its own. And then we've got, of course, lots of domestic competition from Airlink, Safair, and Semair as an example. So what I wanted to just go through this is if we look at just, you can see here the light blue is domestic. And during COVID, domestic obviously became big because so many foreign markets closed down. But what if we click on domestic here, we can see that this is what the average load factor looks like per flight. And when you look at that curve, and you're looking at it, let's say in this period here, the number is 106. How does it make sense to fly a 737 in that market? It would seem to me it's someone like Semair with smaller airplanes, regional jets essentially, and someone like Airlink with Embraers is the right, to use an African phrase, using enough gun. They're not flying a 737 or something that size. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a very fascinating point you're raising over there. And it's something that I've discussed this with with Airlink and with Safair as well on this, and I don't think there's a single right answer to that. This 106 is an average, so obviously that means there's some flights with 50 and there's some flights with 150 as well.
Sure.
And there are some markets, like the Golden Triangle markets, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and seasonal flights to places like George or Bloemfontein or stuff like that, which will be able to support 737 sized aircraft. Johannesburg, Cape Town, I think it's one of the top 10 domestic routes anywhere in the world. So, there's huge volume there. So the larger aircraft you have at the lower unit cost base, the more, potential for profitability you have. But in the South African market, there are a limited number of these. There's a handful of domestic markets, and maybe a Harare, maybe a Maputo or Lusaka, which could potentially do this regionally. I think Safair is reaching the point right now where they are struggling to find enough markets to put their fleet into that they can operate profitably and with sufficient enough frequency to make opening a new station worthwhile. There's very little point opening up an international station and then only being able, having all the overhead of running that station and everything else to only be able to serve it maybe twice a week. So I think Safair is reaching a point right now where their larger gauge aircraft are maxed out in the market, and they're going to have to look at which markets they can potentially serve further afield. They've started regional routes in the last year or so, Harare, Mauritius. It's a handful of different routes,
Right.
that they're actually flying.
Right.
And I think there's going to be a limit in terms of what they can do with that. They'll be able to get Namibia, maybe a Malawi, maybe Angola, but there's not going to be more than maybe 5 to 6 more aircraft worth of deployment of 737 gauge aircraft that they'd be able to deploy from a South African base to that. Airlink, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. Airlink has a wonderful fleet which gives them the flexibility, pretty much everything from 35 seats up to 120 seats, from Embraer 135s all the way up to Embraer 195s. But while this allows them to serve markets that a Safair couldn't come into, whether that's one of these, a Kimberley or something as such domestically, or
Right.
a Tet or a Walvis Bay or similar in in the region. At the same time, on the trunk Golden Triangle routes, the Johannesburg, Cape Towns, Durbans, and the like, 120 seater does not give you the same economics as 189 all economy seater like
Sure.
like Safair does. Safair's unit costs are probably around 15, 20 or even more lower than what Airlink has. Now, Airlink right now is offering a different type of product. They're offering included baggage, meals, and things like that, so they can afford to pull that premium. But that also means that they're restricting themselves in terms of what kind of growth they're going to tap into. The growth in all markets in Africa is pretty much coming from the bottom end of the market, from first-time travelers, recently economically empowered consumers. And those are going to go for the cheapest prices, and they don't really care about the flows. So I think Airlink, just like Safair's struggle is with too large gauge, Airlink's trouble is with too small gauge. I think Airlink has actually acknowledged this. They've wet leased over the last year a 737 that's been running their trunk domestic routes. I think it just flies Joburg, Cape Town on some of their flights all day. So they've got a domestic wet lease in there. And that's something we may see more of.
Right.
I'm not entirely convinced that Airlink's going to stick to an all Embraer model.
Right.
I think whether it's going to be with more wet leases or whether it's going to be actually acquiring Boeing or Airbuses of their own, it's just going to become necessary in order to maintain a cost structure that's competitive with Safair in these trunk markets, while at the same time leveraging the benefits of the scalable Embraer fleet in their secondary and regional markets, which they've done very successfully. I mean, both Safair and Airlink are very successful with their models. I don't think they compete head on. I think they're targeting very different market sectors, even in the same markets. But both of those models have their limitations, and both of them are going to have to find a way to break out of that if they're going to expand beyond what they're currently doing.
Right. An interesting data point that I think may not be apparent to many people. Airlink is now the largest Embraer fleet in all of Africa. And I think that's the first point. The second point I would like to make here is I think the Safair and Airlink situation is they have to go north, beyond the border.
Well, there's nowhere to go other than north. I mean, they are in South Africa.
Right. Yes, but what I'm saying is they have to go international, or starting with regional. I know that Safair had a flight to, I think, Kenya, and that didn't seem to work very well for them. So
now, Airlink has, Airlink, I believe, actually has more destinations outside South Africa than it does inside South Africa. And this is partly a legacy of, when they operated as South African Airways franchise, they were very fortunate to already have the traffic rights granted to them during the time that the International Air Services Council was, fell off the face of the earth for 2 years during COVID. And, that allowed them to restart under their own code in a lot of these markets and gain a bunch of market share before others could. They've also opened up new markets. Malawi, where I am right now, is a classic example. Airlink got their designation in 2022, about 2 years ago. They took their time. They planned an entry. They entered with 3 ERJ 135s each to Lilongwe and Blantyre, and now they're flying 5 times a week to Blantyre. They've upgauged Lilongwe to to the E-Jets 175s, 170s, 190s, and they've taken over a significant chunk of the market, as well as brought prices down, compared to the Malawi Airlines and South African Airways duopoly that existed when they entered. So I think Airlink has definitely been able to deliver well in the regional market in Southern Africa. And they've been able to create service, even if at a slightly higher price than consumers like to pay. But, having markets like Ndola nonstop to Johannesburg on a daily basis, or Tet or Vilankulos, or, there's just so many of these secondary cities throughout Southern Africa that are so perfectly suited for, a 35 to 75 or even 100-seater aircraft, if not daily, but at least 4 or 5 times a week. And I think Airlink has done well with that. Safair, on the flip side, their fleet mix means they're stuck with the Harares, with the Maputos, with the Lusakas, Vic Falls, maybe in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam overnight. But Mauritius, that's the kind of stuff they're stuck with. But when you're looking into these models, how receptive are international travelers in Africa? Domestic, fine, they've proven. Proof of concept has worked. Low cost, everything sold a la carte is fine. Your traders coming from Kenya to South Africa, do they accept the absolute no frills model kind of thing? Pay for every ounce of baggage you take. They probably will. I mean, both Kenya and South Africa have had that domestically. It's just going to take a lot of effort for them to market it right, if that's the kind of market they go into. And there's not a lot of markets like this out there that could even do it, even with going into every market within 737 range from South Africa. That'll maybe be a dozen to 20 at most that they could feasibly serve on a daily basis with the 737 profitably. And so I think that, while Airlink's got potentially 100 different markets that they could go into, all these secondary cities with, everywhere with customs and a runway, I think that the options for Safair are significantly limited. And remember, Safair has a bit of an existential crisis right now. They are fighting to save their license over questions over their ownership, their foreign ownership there. So I think for Safair, it's very much a case of, see what they have to do in terms of restructuring their shareholding and stuff like that before they start changing their model significantly. Kirby Gordon at Safair, he's spoken a lot publicly about this last year in terms of when they were first entering international markets, how it's just a baby step. It's more of of an experiment to see how these markets react and how their model reacts before they jump in with both feet. And I think they've just dedicated one airframe to flying international right now, so that's pretty much based on the international side of OR Tambo, and it flies back and forth all day. But I think that's been the smart way of doing it. They've not assumed that what worked for them domestically is going to automatically work internationally, and at some point they've got to see if it works, double down on it. If it's not working, pull out and see what will.
Okay, let's take a look here. Again, we can look at this way. These are Bloemfontein, Cape Town, Durban, East London, George, Joburg, Kimberley, Port Elizabeth, and Uppington. Those are the key airports. And if we click it, we can see how big these airports are. Joburg is around 40% of the market. Cape Town is around 30% of the market. So I'm just interesting to see when you talk about the Golden Triangle, and here we have Durban, and we can see that those 3 markets, pretty much that's the business.
It's 80%. Yeah, it's 80 to 90% of the domestic market is there. What I think is actually really interesting about South Africa, and if you look at the international, you'll probably see this. And I played with these numbers, a few months ago to have a look at this. if you look at the international, you'll see that Cape Town's share of international traffic has grown
Look
significantly
at
since
this.
the
Here we are.
pandemic. And this is a yeah.
Here we can.
And that is a very interesting thing because you've seen a lot more airlines begin to start flights directly into Cape Town. That's been the US carriers have all gone into Cape Town and, in mass. European carriers have started it. There's been a lot of new service into Cape Town, while Johannesburg has lost service as South African Airways has become, a shell of what its former self.
Right.
How much of that is actually demand that's being stimulated in Cape Town versus passengers who used to fly to Cape Town via Johannesburg anyway, because that's where the flights went? And I think that is, it's an interesting question. It's one that South African tourism has tried to answer with completely muddled conclusions every time I've talked to them. And it's, it's something that South African Airways believes is indicative of Cape Town's strength as an international gateway. They started their Brazil flights from Cape Town.
The rise in traffic from
that,
the rise from 12%, it's doubled in just in a few years there. It's amazing.
Yeah, and even in absolute terms, Cape Town has more absolute international passengers in 2023 financial year, I believe, than they did pre-COVID. So this is, Cape Town is actually larger today as an international airport than it was before a pandemic, despite the South African market as a whole being down. So Cape Town's importance as a gateway to South Africa has grown. It's still not Johannesburg. It's it's not up to that level yet, but it's definitely making inroads into the Johannesburg or bust mindset that used to exist before COVID. So, a lot of that is due to SA. SA is Hamburg, Johannesburg, and that really hasn't changed. They still fly a bulk of their international operations from Johannesburg. They just fly two weekly Cape Town to Sao Paulo, but I think the international carriers definitely have made Cape Town as an international gateway, and consequently as an onward connection, point, because the tourists are not just coming to go to Cape Town; they're going to go from Cape Town to whether that's going to be Victoria Falls or Kruger or wherever else they're going from Cape Town. That means the domestic routes going outward from Cape Town are also becoming more more popular as a result of that tourist traffic or even business traffic that's coming into the Western Cape as opposed to Gauteng or elsewhere. So, and I saw this, and I can't remember when exactly. It was one of the it was either South African Tourism or Statistics South Africa had a publication last year about the province of destination for international visitors, and I found this fascinating. That while almost every region of origin of visitor to South Africa primarily visited Gauteng or KZN, it was actually North American traffic, which was primarily in Western Cape. And again, that's, I didn't have old data on this. This was just I think it was a 2022 or 2023 figures. But I think it was fascinating to show that how that North American and potentially a big chunk of the European market as well actually is targeting Western Cape, while overwhelmingly, I'm talking like 80% overall, visitors to South Africa go to Gauteng and KZN. But North American and to a smaller extent European visitors are Western Cape. And it just shows it's a very different it could be a very different market for different origins.
As a former Cape Townian, I totally get it. I wanted to show you, this is interesting. If you look at the number of passengers per flight, the Cape Town flights are flying. I mean, there's just more the bigger airplanes, fuller airplanes. Joburg is down here on the purple. Durban is down here. That's a big jump there. The average Cape Town flight is close to 200 people. Joburg is 112. Now, of course, again, it's back to averages. Johannesburg gets a bunch of 380 still. So, it's back to averages.
No, and I think that's very true because, just as we were saying, Cape Town has become a popular destination for long-haul flights. And the long-haul operators, these are the international long-haul guys, the Delta A350s, the United 777s, A330s, and stuff like that. Those are larger aircraft than the A320s and 737s that most international carriers from Africa, at least, are flying into Johannesburg. So Johannesburg still has a much larger chunk of the overall traffic, but it's a smaller gauge because it's higher frequency. While Cape Town is much more long haul traffic nowadays, and as I said, it links it reiterates the point that that the tourism statistics report had that passengers from North America and Europe tend to be targeting Western Cape as opposed to Gauteng or KZN, which are the popular destinations from Asia and within Africa and Australia.
Something that I found this very interesting. If you look at Cape Town international traffic from around 2020, departures 51%, arrivals 41%. What we're seeing here, and then the next year it flipped, but what we're seeing is a steady growth in more people are leaving than arriving. You know what that means, right? There's a migration. There's a migration thing here.
It could mean that. It could mean that, but also, as we said,
look at
it's a
Durban.
lot of people.
Durban is more inbound. And of course, Joburg, you would expect also more outbound. It's marginal, but Cape Town is showing a stronger amount of outbound traffic. Now, of course, it could be people enter the country in one place, they leave another place. There's all kinds of games here. But I thought that was a very interesting data point that I had not noticed before. And this is the Golden Triangle, which you've mentioned, which is really fascinating. Domestic flights, passenger per flight. There was this big jump here. I'm not quite sure why, but that everything after COVID, of course, is crazy. Just interesting to see that these three markets, as you said, this is 80% of the entire domestic traffic. Even internationally,
internationally, it's pretty much everything. I mean, there's a couple of flights from from Mpumalanga, and I think that's it for international scheduled flights from South Africa, other than those three.
And I'm just going to domestic passengers. Okay, we can see here Kimberley's also trying to find a life. International, there's basically three gateways. Let's see what we can get here. And this is where domestic passengers, and you can see here, this is nationwide. Domestic passenger traffic is down. International traffic is also down year over year, which I think, as strong as the market is, it's not like it used to be in the good old days, so to speak.
Well, when you take huge competitors out of, I mean, SA is a shell of what it used to be. Comair is no more. Comair and Kulula brands were, if not the market leaders, but very close, up to there. I mean, Safair has grown, Lyft has entered the market, Airlink has significantly expanded their flying, but you cannot replace that level of market share overnight profitably. And I think that's been where a lot of what these guys have done is, certainly they've tried to buy a bunch of market share, but they've not gone into the market completely recklessly by like, all right, let's just get as many planes we want, buy the market share. I think both Airlink and Safair are professionally run. SA slightly less so, and the two leaders have not tried to buy market share. Lyft has shown itself to be extremely smart. Their model of the wet lease and partnership with Global, where they're not actually operating their own planes, they're operating planes that Global, who's their shareholder / partner, is using. They've pulled out of Cape Town to Durban nonstops during the southern winter, where there's obviously a lot less traffic there. They're focusing on Johannesburg hub during the southern winter, and I've taken those planes and put them out on wet lease. So one of those planes has gone to Uganda Airlines. One of those planes has gone to I think the Czech Republic with Smart Wings. So they've pulled aircraft out of Lyft's domestic service during the low season and put them out on wet lease to make money. And I'm sure that, come October and November, you'll see those planes or other planes, trotting their way back into South Africa, ready to start picking up the Golden Triangle, in the golden season.
Right. So it's interesting. I totally agree with your assessment there. Arbitrage, that's the bottom line. And if you in the Lyft Global relationship allows that. Nobody loses, and they de-risk their business very, very effectively.
And who else has done a good job with that is South African Airways. Not in terms of leasing out, but leasing in. What they did last summer with Express, and potentially, I believe they've got an MOU to go up to maybe even 20 airframes at a peak. Obviously not this year; they're not ready for for that. But it's ideal. I know the kind of numbers. I've had clients that were looking for wet leases over the northern winter, and last year and this year, the winter numbers for these wet leases are an absolute steal. You're talking, in the $2,000 an hour ACMI, which is cheaper than you actually get by taking an aircraft and running it yourself, because you don't have maintenance
Sure.
reserves, you don't have anything. So it's a smart thing to do. And I know politically it may not be, these are jobs going to Turkish pilots and Turkish cabin crews and so forth. But from a business perspective, I think, the South African taxpayer should be glad. I think that's a smart decision that South African Airways took for a change. And I think that might be something we see a lot more of. I know from the ACMI side, I'm dealing with a lot of ACMI operators from Europe and elsewhere, and they're targeting Africa, not just South Africa, but all over Africa in terms of seasonal winter leases to place their aircraft, because the demand in Europe simply isn't there in winter, and the demand from Europe is through the roof in summer. So they've got to find somewhere
Right.
to put those planes, just steal of a deal in the winter season.
It's interesting you mention that, because I've seen that used extensively in Canada. And they have a relationship, I think, with a Czech operator, and they move airplanes around, which is it's a very smart move. And the last question,
and because the markets are completely opposite each other. In Canada, come winter in Canada, everyone wants to be a snowbird and go off to the Caribbean.
Exactly.
And that's the time where the Europeans have very quiet
Hibernate.
Aircraft. Exactly. While the flip side is in Canada in summer, everything's so wonderful at home, you just don't want to go anywhere. While
Exactly.
the Europeans are bouncing all off to the Italies and Croatia and Spain,
Right.
and all the little beaches. So it's an ideal relationship, and I think Africa has entered the discussion.
Excellent. Good. Last question, because we've had a nice broad chat here. Semair. Does somebody just swallow that company because they're operating like a minnow quietly under the mouth of the sharks? Very, very interesting situation there.
See, Semair is one person. It's Miles van der Molen, and Semair will do whatever Miles thinks is the smart decision. And knowing Miles, he is brilliant. He's playing 4-dimensional chess while everybody else is playing 2-dimensional. I would never count Semair out of anything. I think he knows when he makes good decisions. He knows when he makes bad decisions. He knows when to pick a fight. He knows when to reconcile with former enemies. I think he's biding his time. I think it may be to be acquired. Maybe that's his exit strategy. But I have my doubts. Semair is too much of Miles's existence. I mean, his entire meaning sort of focuses around Semair family and dogs. And if you actually go to Semair's office, you find all three of them together. The dog and his son tend to be wandering around sometimes. So, I think I don't see Miles seeking to sell, but I also don't see Miles refusing a sale. Maybe it's Qatar's after Semair, who knows? But I think Semair has their niche, and I think they're going to be conservative within the niche, except for a few selected, probes that go out and say, let's try this and see if it works, and let's try that and see if it works. And if they don't, he has no qualms in terms of saying that didn't work. Jump.
Sean, fantastic conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Look forward to the next one.
Okay.